Hello, and welcome to another video lecture from Mr. Mosier. This is part 2 of a 3-part series looking at the important events leading up to the American Civil War between 1820 and 1861. We left off with issues 1, 2, and 3 last time, looking at the areas of compromise with the compromise of the Missouri Compromise that brought in Maine as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and set up that 3630 line that said slavery would only be allowed south of that line. North of that line, no slavery could exist in those territories. We looked at the Compromise of 1850 that upset this balance between the number of free states and slave states. California comes in as a free state, so now there are more free states than there are slave states. And it also passed a very strict fugitive slave law that was greatly opposed by many Northerners, which in response, people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, an abolitionist, will write the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. That will begin to change people's attitudes and perceptions about the South and their use of slave labor to produce cotton. That was a very important part of the industries of the North in the textile factories. So today we're going to look at some more issues, 3 more issues, that brought us closer to the American Civil War. Again, our guiding question for these 3 parts is, was the Civil War inevitable? Meaning that, was this something that was going to happen no matter what? Or was the Civil War preventable, meaning that could it have been stopped? Could there have been some kind of grand compromise or solution that could have occurred throughout these events that maybe could have prevented us from going down the road to conflict? The textbook readings for this 3 issues that we'll be looking at today, which deals with the crisis mostly in Kansas. So we have the trouble in Kansas, which is found on page 483 to 487, and then political divisions between 488 and 492. Our guiding questions for this series will look at what is popular sovereignty, what new political party was created in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, what were they opposed to, what is meant by the phrase bleeding Kansas, what did the Supreme Court rule in the Dred Scott Decision, and then how did Lincoln benefit politically from the Lincoln-Douglas debates that take place in 1858. So let's look here at our next issue, issue number 4, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was an act put into place to try and organize the territory here in the middle of the country, which was part of the old territory of the Louisiana Purchase. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 clearly stated that this territory north of that 3630 line was going to be off limits for the expansion of slavery. But in 1854, a law is going to get passed that's going to change that up just a little bit. A senator from Illinois, a guy named Stephen Douglas, wanted to build a transcontinental railroad starting in Chicago, which is up here in Illinois, across the middle of the country to connect to the new state of California, which at this time is like 4 years old. To do that, this middle territory is going to have to get organized and set up and established. But to do that, to create this railroad, Douglas is going to need votes in the Senate to get this law passed. And he needs Southern votes. Southerners are looking at a way of maybe renegotiating their position with this numbers of free states and slave states, because they're right now behind now that California was added in as a free state. So Douglas sets up a compromise with them, which says that if the Southern senators will go along with his plan to build this railroad and organize these territories, he will open this up using the concept known as popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is a policy of letting a people of an area make their own decisions on the issue of slavery. So instead of Congress saying this territory is open to slavery or this territory is closed off to slavery, it'll be up to the people living in that territory to make the final decision. So the citizens of Kansas and Nebraska and those territories would have to make the final decision. If they vote to allow slavery, then those territories would be open to slavery. If the people of those territories vote no, we don't want slavery, then they will be closed off from slavery. This sort of changes the policy of the Missouri Compromise, which said it before, slavery could not exist anywhere in those territories. That 3630 line here said no slavery north of that line. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act changed that to say that slavery could be a possibility if the people in that region voted for it, which is exactly what the South wanted, in the hopes that Kansas would probably come in as a slave state, and maybe Nebraska and some of this other territory would eventually come in as a free state, keeping that balance, trying to get back to that balance between the North and the South. Now, this is going to have a huge repercussions in the North, because the Northerners felt this had already been a settled issue. Slavery was not allowed north of that 3630 line. And so in response, a new political party was created in 1854 that we know today as the Republican Party. The Republican Party was a Party created in direct response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now that slavery was open to this territory, the Republican Party was founded out of a couple different groups. One group known as the Free Soilers. These were people that believed that slavery should not be open to the territories out to the west. The Whigs, which was a political party that was in existence before the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that will basically all but collapse and fall apart because it couldn't stop the act from passing through Congress. And you even had some Northern Democrats, the other major political party at the time, who were very upset that slavery was now opening up into the West. So if you joined the Republican Party in 1854, you were pretty much saying, I was against the expansion of slavery. I am against the expansion of slavery in those particular territories. You weren't necessarily an abolitionist. You didn't say that you wanted slavery abolished everywhere, but you didn't want to see slavery expanding out to those Western territories. Now, it sounds like a good idea, popular sovereignty. Let the people decide. If they want to have slavery, they should be able to decide the issue themselves, right? That's part of living a democracy, is letting the people decide. The problem, though, is it led to tremendous amounts of violence in Kansas. We call this violence bleeding Kansas. So throughout the mid to late 1850s, Kansas will be embroiled into a horrible conflict, a civil war in a sense, between these pro-slavery forces, most of those coming out of Missouri, and anti-slavery forces coming out of many of these northern states will start flooding into the region of Kansas, and you'll get violence breaking out between these two very opposed groups. For example, in the city of Lawrence, Kansas, you have a group of Missourian pro-slavery forces, Missouri Ruffians as they were known as, coming into Lawrence and burning the town down to the ground. In response, you had John Brown, a character we'll talk about in a coming lecture series, in response, go and kill 5 pro-slavery settlers who had really nothing to do with the burning of Lawrence, and will kill them in a very brutal fashion, hacking them to death with broadswords near a place called Pottawatomie Creek, which is now located in Franklin County, Kansas. So for the next couple of years, between 1854 and really till 1860, Kansas is really embroiled into bloody conflict, a civil war between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery forces. Both sides try to set up their own governments, and they are just kind of fighting and killing each other back and forth. This violence led to what is probably one of the largest standing college sports rivalries, which is the rivalries between the Kansas schools and the Missouri Tiger schools. The citizens of Kansas who tried to stop these pro-slavery forces call themselves the Jayhawkers, which is, if you follow college sports, know that that's the mascot of the Kansas University, the University of Kansas. And so for next couple of years, this violence is going to be embroiled. And even today, there's this rivalry between the Kansas and Missouri states. A lot of that stems from this bleeding Kansas that takes place in the 1850s. Now, violence wasn't just limited to Kansas. It actually will start spreading as far as the Capitol in Washington, D.C. The picture you see here is a dramatic print showing a violent incident that occurred in Congress on May 22nd, 1856. Which inflamed sectional passion, meaning that the violence between the North and the South, these beliefs between the North and the South are really getting to a fever pitch. Here you have sitting down here, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who's going to be attacked by a congressman from South Carolina, a man named Preston S. Brooks, where he has a colleague, Lawrence Keat, who's standing here with a gun and a cane holding back all these other senators, as this congressman will beat Sumner almost to death. He'll take his cane with a little golden knob and smash it over his head, creating almost permanent brain damage. Sumner will never really ever completely recover from this incident. But both sides, both men are going to be seen as heroes from their region. Sumner is going to be seen as a hero in the North, speaking out against slavery, and Brooks is going to be seen as a hero in the South, trying to defend the honor of the South. These two different sides being kind of playing out. So not only are we seeing violence played out in Kansas, but we're also seeing violence in our Capitol building as well between the North and the South. Next issue number 5, is the famous Dred Scott Decision. This is a Supreme Court decision that settled the issue of a particular slave and his family known as Dred Scott. Dred Scott, who was a slave whose master worked in the U.S. military, was called to a different post into the state of Illinois and to the territory of Illinois, which will become eventually Wisconsin, and then will bring his slave, Dred Scott, and Dred Scott's family back with him to Illinois, and the owner dies. And so Scott sues for his freedom, saying, hey, I lived in the north of that 3630 line. That territory up north is open to not have slavery. It's not supposed to have slavery up in that region. And so he sued for his freedom, and eventually the Supreme Court will take on the case and will rule, but not in favor of Dred Scott. Most historians argue that this is probably one of the worst Supreme Court decisions that were ever made. It had basically three big parts to it. The first part was that slaves are property, meaning that Dred Scott had no standing in the case. He could not sue because technically, according to the court and Chief Justice Taney, who writes the decision, says that slaves are property, and property cannot sue because they're not people. They have no standing. The second part of the ruling, which was another very damaging part, said that African Americans were never intended to be U.S. citizens and could never be U.S. citizens. And third, slavery can exist in any U.S. territory that no law can stop the spread of slavery. That means the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and even popular sovereignty in itself is also unconstitutional. Any kind of law passed by Congress that limits where slavery can exist is unconstitutional. This case is going to have huge ramifications, especially in the North. The North feels that now slavery is now open to expand out into the Western territories, and they are extremely angry and extremely furious now that you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act that said popular sovereignty opened it up to slavery, and now the Supreme Court has come back and said it's open season. Slavery can exist anywhere. So the big political issue of the time period in the late 1850s was, of course, the issue of slavery and the territories out to the west. Where should slavery be allowed? Should it not be allowed? Should it be allowed? And the election in 1858 for many Senate seats, the issue of slavery comes up and brings into the very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen Douglas was the main leader of the Democratic Party and the gentleman who's behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He is the leader of the Democratic Party, especially there in the North. And he is up for re-election. A relatively young, unknown politician outside of Illinois, a man named Abraham Lincoln, who tried for the Senate seat earlier and had lost, was making another run at it against Stephen Douglas. And the issue of slavery is definitely front and center. Stephen Douglas, the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and popular sovereignty, argues that popular sovereignty is the best way to settle the issue of slavery. Let the people decide on the issue of slavery in their territories. Lincoln comes at it from a more of a Republican stance, which says slavery should not be open into these Western territories, and takes a more of a moral issue, saying that slavery is wrong and we shouldn't allow slavery to expand out to the West. And so these two men will have debates throughout the election of 1858. Now back then, these debates ran about 3 hours in length, both men arguing their positions and questioning each other. From many outside observers, it looked as if Lincoln was actually gaining the upper hand. It looked like Lincoln was winning these debates and could potentially win the election. On the night of the election, it was really close. Now remember, in 1800s, back then, the state legislatures voted for the state senators. It was not done by the popular vote of the citizens. The state legislatures themselves actually voted for the senators. The House of Representatives were voted by the people, but the senators were voted by the state legislatures, and Lincoln loses in a very close election. Stephen Douglas does win his re-election. He does go back to the Senate as the senator from Illinois. But Lincoln does so well in the debates that he kind of sets the stage for his potential run for presidency in 1860. Many Republicans in the North saw Lincoln as a possible candidate for the future. Here's the guy who went toe-to-toe with the leading Democratic Party member of the North, and here's a possible guy we could run for president in 1860. So even though Lincoln loses the debate in 1858, and loses the election, I should say, in 1858, he does do very well politically, where he is setting the scene here for him to possibly run for president in 1860. So here are 3 more causes of the American Civil War. Things are getting a little bit more heated, where violence is now breaking out in Kansas and in the floors of Congress between the North and the South. And the issue of slavery is very much dividing the nation between the North and the South. The South is wanting to see slavery expand out to the West, especially these Western territories like Kansas and Nebraska. And the North is saying, no, slavery should only exist in the Deep South, not allowed to go out West. Hopefully over time we can maybe see the abolition of slavery, but we should not definitely see slavery go out West. So again, thank you very much for listening, and as always, if you have questions, please see your teacher.